Hello, my name is Parker, and welcome to my channel if you're new here. Today I decided we were going to deviate from our usual schedule of Nothing Left to Lose to read you guys this story that I wrote back in August. I wrote it in inspiration of one of my favorite YouTubers of all time on here. They wrote a story and asked someone to write it longer and in a different amount of detail, and so I did. And they beta read it along with a few of my other friends. So I do hope that this does reach your expectations. This is the story that I wrote myself. And the art in here, I didn't know what to make it, so I simply made it the Roman Colosseum to kind of represent what we have here. So, without further ado, this is The Borrower's Tale by me. Virgil had vague memories of a time when he used to be a happy borrower. They were what many called freaks of nature, although they were happy then because they went majorly unnoticed. It had never bothered them to not be known. It was only a few years ago, but by now it had been nearly 10 years, when the other borrower, which got them caught, was found. Virgil was only around 7 years old. He remembered his mom shushing him and pushing him far away from the human. It was no use, though. He had almost wished that she hadn't made that effort. It only made things worse for him. Maybe he wouldn't have been sold to the barbarians that were mean and terrible, the people who never seemed to care. Until he was 10, he was forced to train at all times that he wasn't sleeping. He was decently fed. By the time that he was 10, he was thrown into essentially being as though he were a Roman gladiator. He was taught to either win or never eat. If he lost, he wouldn't be allowed to generally take care of himself. He didn't really care all that much for his personal hygiene, but what he did care for was his hunger. He felt his stomach grumble at the thought. He was fairly strong, but he had found that the more he took on, the more he felt exhausted. It would be easier if he hadn't needed to take care of another borrower. However, he knew it wasn't that simple. He was aware of that because his slightly younger friend, if you could call him that, was experimented on. He wasn't likely to fight. He fought for both of their survival, not because he liked the companionship, but because he couldn't bring himself to let another person suffer just because he hadn't wanted to put in a little extra labor. After all, he had been trained for several years in order to fight, and the other borrower hadn't. Janus, the other borrower, had been experimented on to give him the strength to fight. The issue with the experimental borrower was that they were unpredictable. The first time he had tried to interact with him, he got bit. Virgil remembered that he was passed out for 3 days and was sick for 2 weeks. Besides, Virgil was used to the exhausted feeling that came with the extreme amount of fights he had to constantly go through. What he was less used to was the being picked up after the fight. He must have disappointed the barbaric human, as he's thrown harshly into his ordinary cage. He wouldn't find any sense in that. He had won the fight. He stood up as tall as he had the ability to and glanced around the cage, despite the fact that he was exhausted and that he wanted nothing more than to ignore the boy laying against the side of the cage. He made a small noise in his throat at the sight of him. Janus wasn't shivering how he usually would whenever Virgil saw him. He was sobbing uncontrollably. "Hey, Jay, are you okay?" he finds himself mumbling, attempting to sound cultivating. Janus gasps loudly, swiping at his mostly covered face and attempts to hide the tears, but all he does is manage to worry him more, as he winces at the feeling of his hand on his skin. He reaches out and jerks him around so that he's facing him. He tries to hide his face, but he lifts his face before he can. To his surprise, he saw his face, which was usually partly discolored on one side, but singed on the same side. His scales that usually covered that side of his face were entirely burnt, not burnt off, but still burnt. Tears flowed easily down his face. Virgil found himself unsurprised. It was absolutely horrifying, yes, but it wasn't surprising to him. He lets out a soft sigh and shakes his head, letting Janice go and moving to his own corner. Usually he would attempt to cheer him up, but he found that he hadn't had the energy. He wished that this wasn't becoming more and more frequent. As soon as he laid down, his mind wouldn't even try to keep him awake. He was woken easily by Janice frantically shaking him. "Virgil, it's time to get up," Janice hissed again and again as he shook him awake. Virgil made a small noise of discontent in his throat, but slowly sat up. He understood the reason he was being woken and was not dumb enough to continue sleeping. He sat up and noted that Janice was no longer crying. Instead, he began to speak way too quickly for Virgil to understand. "Jay, calm down. I just woke up. I can't understand you," he chirped quietly. Janice pauses, his eyes going wide, but he slowly nods. He doesn't get the chance to start again, because the human quickly approaches. "Come on, bastard, it's time for the next fight," he shouts, and in the second the cage door swings open and he grabs him by the arm, yanking him out, and slams the cage door. He lets it happen, knowing it's unlikely he'll survive to protect Janice if he struggles. He can feel the panic rising in his chest at the sight of the other borrower. He is a very obvious lab borrower, with his long body that looks stretched and his seemingly glowing gray eyes. He knows he hardly has a chance, if any at all. He's strong, but those who are genetically modified literally have a genetic advantage. The second that they are let into the ring, the huge borrower is nearly on top of Virgil, and it's all he can do to tear himself away from getting caught into a headlock. What he doesn't expect is the fact that his leg is there and quickly sweeps his feet out from under him. The other borrower doesn't make any noise other than a garbled one that sounds like a quick apology. Virgil doesn't have time to dwell on this, though, because in seconds he is so bloodied that he can't see, and even breathing has become hard and labored. He attempted to fight back, but he wasn't dumb enough to believe that it wouldn't get him punished. He fought to stay awake and at least make it look like he wasn't being pummeled into the ground. After what could have only been a few minutes, which felt like an eternity, they pull them apart, and the owner lifts him off the ground. He feels the spray of water over his badly bruised body as the rags that they called clothing are torn off him to be replaced. They don't even bother him at this point to clean them. They don't even bother to clean them at this point when they get that badly bloodied. It doesn't specifically bother him anymore. It used to, but no longer does, considering the amount of times that he has had either his or someone else's blood all over him has desensitized him to being stripped. Within a few moments, he quickly is covered in the raggy cloth. It covers most of his skin, the sleeves long and the pants just a bit baggy. The lady cleaning him sneered at him and set him in the cage he had been in every single time that he had fought. As far as he was aware, the pristine cage belonged to the barbaric owner. The owner storms into the room, throwing some money at the lady, and picks up the crate by its handle, swinging it violently, though Virgil simply dug his nails deep into the soft padding beneath him. He felt the swinging stop, and he knew they were in front of the usual cage that he was used to. He lets his nails free from the soft padding, and the cage vaults him out of it. The door was quickly slammed shut, and Janice rolled his eyes at him. "You don't have to fight on my behalf, you know. I'm perfectly content pissing him off by doing nothing," he states towards Virgil, who spits out a slight amount of blood. "Yeah, but I'm not just gonna let you die," Virgil growls back annoyedly. Janice simply rolls his eyes at him. Neither of them acknowledge the fact that the more that Virgil fights and loses, the more likely he is to be found and sold by the cleaner. A man who slummed through the shadows of the fights, buying any and all less than desirable borrowers. Virgil leans on the edge of the cage. "I need to get some rest for my next fight," he states, closing his eyes. Even with his eyes closed, he can feel Janus roll his eyes at him. He can't help but feel sort of at peace. After all, if he can keep this 1 ounce of normalcy, he can keep pushing his limits. He let his mind wander for a moment before it drifted off into unconsciousness. Virgil didn't even realize he was asleep when he felt the entire cage start violently shaking. It was freezing cold, although that wasn't new at all. He'd never been able to get comfortable on the concrete lake floor. "Wake up, you little shit," the man roared as he shook the cage. Virgil glanced at Janus, only to find that the other borrower looked sick, but otherwise mostly fine. Even his scales looked much better than they had mere hours before. He slept in. That wasn't good at all. Fighting groggy had never done him good before. "You better at least put up a good fight, or I'll sell you and that little labrat of yours to the cleaner." His voice filled with malice and so much cold-hearted honesty. Shit. Oh, fuck. He feels the panic rising up, but he knows he doesn't have the privilege to be panicked. He has to win this fight. He can't lose it. He has to survive this encounter, not for him, but for Janus. Janus, who wouldn't survive a day as a fighter. He couldn't breathe, and he only barely saw the punch swinging towards his face. Yet he was not quick enough to avoid the knee that quickly slammed into his stomach. Virgil buckled over in extreme pain. He was so tired, and this just wasn't worth it. "I'm sorry," was the very soft whisper that came from the other borrower. Virgil let out a soft growl, but couldn't bring himself to stand back up. Seconds later, and the world went black around the borrower, and his consciousness slipped away. Janus let out a small squeak as he watched the borrower, who had cared enough to keep him alive, go down through a hole in the cage. He watched in horror as he entirely passed out, and the owner walked over with extreme anger in his eyes. The man brings Virgil over very quickly, throwing him into the cage harshly. Janus threw himself under Virgil as fast as he could. He wasn't nearly as strong as Virgil, though, and he is quickly thrown back into the bottom of the cage from the force of Virgil's weight, and stills the second he hears the owner begin speaking. "Guess they were right about needing to replace them every 2 years, he hissed, and walked a few feet away. "Are you the cleaner?" the owner asks harshly. Janus can't hear any response and has to hope that maybe, just maybe, it could be a bluff. "Good," the owner growls, and this time there's a soft response. "How much?" The voice is so cold that it causes a shiver to go through Janus. He's never heard something so cold and analytical. Not even in the owner or the scientists that worked with him while he was in the lab sounded like that. "Well, you'll be getting the lab rat and the useless fighter you just saw there, so I want 500 for both," the owner stated in irritation. The cleaner let out a humorous laugh. "I'll give you 400, he responded, absolutely emotionless. "That's a rip-off! I spent 500 on the fighter and 300 on the lab rat," he yelled, aggravation evident in his voice. Silence completely overtakes the pairing for a moment before the cleaner speaks again. "Well, you're asking me to take an entirely unpredictable and experimental borrower, and a fighter that I'm sure you've gotten a good amount of revenue from," he grumbles back at the owner. There was some more hushed arguing that Janus couldn't hear, nor understand anything that the pair said. "Fine!" the owner yelled. Soon the cage was violently picked up and thrusted into the arms of the other man. It didn't take long for them to continue moving. The cage didn't swing as though it was being held by the handle, but as though it was being held with a hand on either side, similarly to the way that the cages used to be held back when he was in the lab. As soon as the thought crosses his mind, Janus begins throwing himself against the door of the cage over and over again. He could not go back. He refused to go back. He knew the cleaner was dangerous, but he hadn't expected him to be a scientist. Calm down. You can get out when you're in the car, the cleaner's voice stated, his voice softer, more kind than Janus had expected it to be. Still, he wasn't just going to stay put. He slammed harshly against the crate door again and again, only stopping when the cleaner stops. And that really isn't by his own choice, because he's entirely thrown back to the back of the cage when they stop their momentum. Remus, please open the cage when I put it in the car, the cleaner asks. Will do, Microsoft nerd. The voice surprises Janus. Although humans are very good at mimicking things, they would have no way to mimic a borrower's voice like that. At least not to that extent. Patton, do you have everything you will require? The cleaner asks as he opens the car door, accidentally throwing the cage off balance. Well, I could always do with more cookies, but yeah, I have everything I need. Another voice. That has to be another borrower. The cage is placed into the car, and the door is slung quickly open. You already have a full sleeve of Oreos. I don't believe they will be comforted by a second sleeve of them, the man chides. The borrower doesn't respond, instead opting into walking to the cage. Janus can see one borrower behind the smaller one. The small one is holding a small clear box with a red cross on it, while the other looks crazy and has long, vine-like appendages sprouting from his back. Look at that, and another testy, the larger one states. The small one throws him a dirty look. Listen, I know this is a lot to take in, but my name is Patton, and this is Remus. We're here to help you, he states kindly. Janus looks back at Virgil. He has to be careful. He has to protect Virgil. He owes him that much after him forcing himself to do so much in order to keep him alive in a life that Janus saw no point in, so he should do the same, right? Can we come in to check on you and your friend's injuries? Patton asks politely. Janus gives the pairing a skeptical look. You can, but he stays out, he states slowly. Patton slightly nods and walks slowly past the door, moving slowly so that Janus can watch his movements. As he gets closer, Janus steps sideways to let him access Virgil, but his eyes never leave Patton. What are your names? I'd like to at least give you that respect. Patton chirps, his eyes locked on Virgil. You can call me J, and he is V. Janus mutters. Alright, well, I guess I should explain a bit. Patton starts easily, trying not to flinch at the sight of the extreme injuries all over his body. I was gifted to Logan what must have been 7 years ago, Patton explains gently. Janus taking out an ointment. What is that? Janus growls, and without hesitation, he hands it over to Janus. It's a bruise ointment, Patton stated as he turned to watch him. Janus tried to look like he was inspecting the ointment. It didn't smell like poison, but he had no way to know what it actually was. He slowly handed it back to him, and Patton casually Patton nodded and rubbed it over each of the differing bruises all over his body. We got to talking, though, and he found out how bad it is to keep a borrower as a pet, Patton continues. Janus sits down to listen, his attention being caught. So he asked me what I wanted to do, and I told him I wanted to help other borrowers, so that's what we did, he chirps, with excitement filling his tone. All right, so what happens after that? Janus asks, his tone smooth, but still filled with skepticism, obvious in his voice. Well, you see, I'm going to ask your friend to stay with us until he's better, but then it's really up to you, Patton answers, smiling vividly. Where do we have to go? Janus mutters. Well, we can either help rehabilitate you, or you can join our community. Logan is the only human who lives with us, but there's a decently big borrower community, he answers, wrapping Virgil's left arm in gauze. So what's the catch if we stay? Janice asks skeptically. Patton gives him a confused look. Well, me and Logan are still pretty close, so sometimes we do research together, but a lot of the others don't even interact with Logan because they are more comfortable like that. Patton responds. Janice doesn't believe that. The human has to want something for his space, he grumbles. Patton only looks more confused. Well, we do ask you help as much as you have the ability to, Patton quietly explains, finally turning towards Janice. Where is the human taking us? He asks, panic filling him. Patton smiles slightly. Logan is bringing us home. We live on the outskirts of this town. He chirps happily. Janice slightly nods. Virgil stirs, but only barely. I'm so bored out here. Can I come in? Remus calls from outside the cage. Patton turns toward Janice with a questioning look. Janice glances at the borrower in question and hesitantly nods. Yeah, come in. Bring the cookies in too, Patton responds. I know I'm hungry. Are you hungry too? Patton asks the last part to Janice. Yeah, food sounds good, he responds. Remus bolts through the door, carrying a sleeve of Oreos, holding it out toward Patton, who takes it with very little hesitation. He opens the sleeve and sets them underneath Virgil's nose. Virgil stares and his eyes flicker open. Where are we? He slurs, his voice cracking. Janice doesn't get the chance to speak. Hey kiddo, I'm Patton. We took you in to save you, Patton answers. Virgil sits up and looks around, seeming to relax the second that his eyes land on Janice. Are you hungry, kiddo? Patton questions, his voice soft and rather kind. Virgil took a moment to process, but the question seems to finally register. Food sounds nice, he responds. Janice hadn't realized how much Virgil being knocked out had done for his stress levels, but he's glad he's awake. Alright, but I'm only going to give you a little. We'll get you something that's better for your stomach when we get to the house, Patton declares, handing him some cookies. Janice finds himself melting at the taste of the cookies. He can't be bought or bribed, and this could all be nothing more than false kindness. However, he couldn't force himself to believe that. Virgil took hold of the cookies and gently bit into it, smiling slightly. So let me tell you about your options, Patton states, causing Virgil to look up at him in confusion. He looks carefully at Janice, who only calmly looks back. You see, I think you should stay with us until you're fully healed, but then you're welcome to leave, Patton announces to Virgil. Virgil doesn't speak, seeming to prefer to do anything else. We can help you rehabilitate, or you can join our community, he continues softly. Janice comes closer. You doing okay, V? He whispers, as quietly as he can manage. Virgil locks eyes with him, the only familiar borrower in the cage with him. The other pairing were not only unfamiliar, but they made Virgil unsure that he would be able to make a rational decision. Not when they were so kind. Even the weird larger one who's quietly whispering to Janice seems nice, even if he quite literally seems to radiate chaos. Community? Virgil rasps. Janice, of course, notices the way that his voice breaks, but he decides for the time being not to bother him about it. Yes, Logan is the only human. Most of us are borrowers, he explained quickly, eating a cookie himself. Virgil wasn't exactly sure what was going on, though through his mind, other than the fact that he was incredibly hungry, more and more as he ate the cookies. Alright then, Virgil mumbled, standing up and walking over to Janice. It was still so cold, and he didn't feel like dealing with it. Feeling better? Janice drawled. Virgil couldn't help but roll his eyes, but he still slid down and coiled into Janice. Neither of them would ever admit how comfortable this was for them. It was rather common that they would cuddle for warmth. Of course, neither of them would admit to that either. "Aw," Patton cooed. Virgil was too tired and cold to care. Janice, however, glared at him and rolled his eyes. Just as Virgil fell asleep, there was a quick, soft argument between Janice and Patton that even Remus, who had advanced hearing, had no idea what was going on. They hushed when they felt that Janice heard what Janice describes as a death trap pulled to a stop. "Patton, would you like me to simply carry all of you inside the cage?" Logan asks as he opens the car door. "Yes, please," Patton responds, and seconds later... Sorry, I got lost. The cage door is closed, as gently as Janice had ever recalled seeing it closed before. Even back when he was in the lab, where everything was pristine, they always closed it harshly. Then the cage was lifted up again, being held with a hand on either side, just as it had been before. It felt like there were mere moments when the cage was finally being sat down on the ground. "All right, you may come out," Logan states, reaching out and opening the cage again. Janice watched with caution, being unable to move in fear of waking the exhausted borrower who was sleeping curled against him. "All right, come on, Remus, let's go check on the others and set them up some space," Patton says. Remus frowns at his friend. "But that's boring. I don't wanna," he whines, acting like he is actually sad. But Patton seems completely unfazed. Come on, please," he begs, sounding slightly hurt. Remus sticks out his tongue and stands quickly, following Patton through the cage door. Janice nudges slightly at Virgil. Even though he should sleep, they can't be vulnerable like this without knowing what to expect. Virgil made a noise of objection, but his eyes still flickered open. Janice looked carefully at the door. "What happened? What's wrong?" Virgil snapped as the grogginess began to disperse. Janice looked carefully at him. "We made it to the cleaner's home," he whispered to Virgil. Virgil goes pale, as if he hadn't realized where they had been to that point. "What?" the whisper yells, flaming his hand against his mouth harshly when he realizes how loudly he had been. Janice rolls his eyes and silently presses closer to Virgil. Patton walks into the cage again. "Oh, hey, V, you're awake. I finished setting up your area," he chortles. Virgil gives him a confused look and looks at Janice. "What is he talking about, Janice?" he demands. Janice shrugs his shoulder, pulling himself into a ball to try and hide from Patton. "I'm sorry, Jay. I didn't mean to scare you," Patton exclaims. Virgil slowly nods his head, grabbing Janice's hand and pulling him to follow the kind borrower. Janice knows not to pull away at this point because it would only get him left alone in this place. Patton leads him to a closet close to the door. "If you go up those little stairs right there, you'll find a little place in the wall just for you and Jay," Patton declares happily. Virgil finds himself softly nodding at this. Janice walks up the steps ahead of Virgil to make sure there isn't anything dangerous. When he makes it into the room that Patton was talking about, he's shocked by what he sees. The room is around the size of the cage, but there is a layer of padding covering the floor. In one corner there is a heap of soft-looking fabric, and in another there is a bookshelf. He looks around and finds there's a dresser in one of the other corners, and the last corner has a desk. It's small, but well-designed. He sighs, smiling as Virgil walks in. Maybe, just maybe, this won't be the end of the Burrower's tale, after all. This story was written by Parker Witch Stories, for and inspired by my role model, Raven, who runs the channel Typically Untypical. Thank you for inspiring me. I hope you enjoyed my story. I really do hope you guys enjoyed my story today. I don't have much to say. I do hope that you guys will go and check her out. She is much more talented than I am, but luckily for me, she is very kind. and I mean they, because I am so bad with pronouns. I am sorry. Ugh, but I'm not re-recording all of that. I'm so tired, guys, but I'm so glad I was able to get this out to give you guys a little bit of a break from our recent episodes. I will see you all next week. Bye!